Good evening, I'm Charlotte and you're watching Flawed Forensics. Tonight we'll be talking about the conviction of Edward Splatt and the many flaws that were involved in this case. On our panel tonight, we'll talk with Marisa, who was one of the members of the jury during the trial, Diane, a commissioner from the South Australian Police Force, and finally Jessen, who is a renowned crime scene investigator on our show. So Jessen, could you give me a brief summary of what exactly happened?
On the 3rd of December 1977, Mrs. Rosa Simper was found murdered in her bedroom at Cheltenham, Adelaide. 4 months later, on the 3rd of March 1978, Edward Charles Splatt was arrested and charged with the murder. 7 months following this arrest, Splatt was formally called for an indictment to court. On the 14th of November 1978, Edward Charles Splatt was convicted of the murder and sentenced to life imprisonment. Not until 3 years later, when a movement called the Shannon Commission on the 5th of April 1983, as a result of the commission, the authority to investigate false judgment was granted and issued to the Splatt case by newly appointed Premier Bannons on the 23rd of December 1982. Thus, preliminary hearings were soon to follow the Royal Commission. As a result, he got pardoned.
Okay, thanks for that, Jessen. Now we have a better understanding of what's happened. Let's go to Diane now to talk about the procedures that are put into place when investigating a crime scene.
Professional police procedures are required at any crime scene to protect public safety, preserve the scene, collect important evidence, and document the situation. There are other divisions that examine the collection, examination, and presentation in court of the evidence.
How does this differ with the Splatt case?
In the Splatt case, the chief investigator was Detective Sergeant Barry Cox and was the first to discover evidence in Mrs. Simper's home. However, he did not follow standard procedures and instead collected, examined, and chose which particular evidence was presented in court.
Okay, thanks for that. We'll discuss more about the evidence later. Let's go to Marisa to talk about how the evidence of the case was presented in court.
Sergeant Cox was the person who presented a majority of the evidence to the court. He was definitely very confident in his findings, and I think this swayed the jury into believing everything he stated as a fact. He had this aura of authority, and everyone knew he was highly respected in his field of work, so no one thought to question why he was involved in so many aspects of the case.
Were there other reasons you believe the jury was led to believe the prosecution case against the defendant?
There were other people involved who were titled as scientific experts. They told us that, for example, there were no relevant dissimilarities between pieces of evidence found on Splatt that were also found at the crime scene. I think the language they used, along with their positions as experts, definitely impacted the jury's decision. It wasn't until years after the case that the news came out that the so-called experts weren't experts at all, and that Sergeant Cox appeared to have targeted Splatt from the beginning.
Okay, so let's talk more about these expert witnesses and the role Cox had in the presentation of evidence.
There were 5 main pieces of evidence found on the victim's bedsheet. These were paint and metal particles, cotton fibers, spicules of foam, and seed endosperms. The evidence presented in court on seeds were based on whether they had been cooked or uncooked. This was an invalid test, as 5 out of 7 seeds were found in his aviary and on her bed. They explained the 2 that didn't match were due to eating habits of the birds. This was never scientifically proven, as Mr. Kutchul was used as the expert, yet he was unqualified in this particular field. This was a problem with seed identification, as the seeds could come from anywhere, for example, a biscuit. As well as the seeds, foam spicules were also presented as highly significant evidence when in fact, of the 12 tiny pieces that were found, there was very limited similarities between them and those in Splatt's car cover. Once again, Splatt presented evidence as significant when it was not based on acceptable scientific protocol.
So Cox appeared to have been in charge of the presentation of these pieces of evidence, and he was also the person who discovered them at the crime scene?
That's correct. Sergeant Cox attended the crime scene and collected the evidence. He then worked alongside with the scientific experts that were called in to the stand. Furthermore, he selected which pieces of evidence were to be used in court based on how effective they would be at incarcerating Splatt. Any evidence that did not specifically target Splatt was completely ignored.
And was this appropriate?
It was extremely inappropriate. There are now specific protocols in place directing who is involved in evidence collection and the amount of interaction allowed between police, crime scene investigators, and scientific witnesses. After the controversy of the Splatt case, the Forensic Services Division was reformed and the State Forensic Science Centre was made, which is independent of the police force. In fact, almost all the critical evidence against Splatt was presented inappropriately, including the use of so-called scientific experts.
That's correct. Scientific experts were called during presentation of the fibre, metal and paint evidence. Ms. Perevic was called to talk about her comparisons with the fibres found in Mrs. Simper's bed, sheets and Splatt's car. She used reagent which she stated reacted in the same manner between the fibres, and microscopy to determine that they were both half cotton and half rayon. Ms. Perevic informed the jury that these fibres were similar in nature, when in fact she was only a professional microscopist, so she could only give her scientific opinion on what they look like under the microscope. She had also never done studies on foam before. This is not an appropriate test to base critical findings on.
Also, there was confusion in the jury as the defence team claimed the car seats were changed between the time the crime was committed and the time the fibres were used as evidence. The prosecution claimed this was not true, but nothing was ever determined, so the jury wasn't sure what to believe or whether to consider the fibres critical evidence or not.
After considering this case, it can be said that much of the evidence presented as critical was majorly flawed, as well as the problems mentioned. There were also flaws in the paint and metal evidence presented. Dr. Barry Collins was the expert witness called for paint and metals. He actually was an expert in his field, but the way he presented his findings were inappropriate.
From memory, he said something along the lines of, "In my opinion, all trace materials found were consistent with contact transfer." To us in the jury, this sounded like a definite case against Splatt. This was coming from a professional after all.
It was also found that Cox had very limited notes on this evidence, which he claimed was so significant. The ratios he presented were not even written after the committal had taken place. He misread important figures to the court, and these numbers changed between his presentation in court and an article he later wrote. His evidence was inconsistent, inadequate, and incorrect.
Cox also performed his own experiment when talking about particles found on the bedsheets of Mrs. Simpers. He said that with scientific certainty, the particles could not have been wind-blown and must have been brought to the scene by a perpetrator. He was clearly not an expert in this field, and if any of these particles had been wind-blown, the ratios would cease to be significant.
Okay, so now that we are all aware of the forensic flaws in this case, how has it impacted the way trials are conducted and also your opinions on Splatt's conviction?
As I said before, there are now clear guidelines separating the police and forensic departments. As a result of this case, there can be no interaction between the two sectors, and therefore the evidence cannot be biased. When it comes to the evidence collection, the police are not involved in the collection, and the processes used by Cox are no longer acceptable.
Based on what has been said about the scientific experts, I think it is important that they are careful in the terminology that they use when discussing the significance of evidence. I think it is important for the jury to be aware that not everything the scientific experts say is concrete. They should discuss the value placed upon the evidential findings and determine its importance in their final decision. I now believe there were so many flaws in this case that it was right for Splatt to be released.
In my opinion, there was too much significance placed on evidence that was incorrectly examined and methods that should not have been accepted as scientifically sound. Based on these findings, I also believe that Splatt was wrongfully convicted.
Splatt was granted a pardon in 1984 and was paid $300,000 by way of compensation. He continues to maintain his innocence. Thank you all for your opinions tonight. This concludes tonight's segment. Thank you all for watching Flawed Forensics, and good night.